Today we're going to cover the politics of right to work. About half of the states in the United States are right to work states. Right to work was a popular policy following the passage of Taft-Hartley in the 1940s, and the passage of that federal labor policy opened up the door for states to pass what we know as right to work. And originally, right to work was very popular in the South. So, southern states that tend to culturally be anti union were quick to pass right to work legislation. Since then, in recent years, states in the Midwest have begun adopting right to work policies, and the Midwest and the coast tend to be a little more pro union than the South. So, breaking into regions where unions tend to be pretty strong is a pretty big deal. So now we've got a little over half of the states in the United States are right to work states. And what does right to work do? Well, right to work laws prohibit compulsory union membership. So they state that no one is required to be a member of a labor union. And they do more than that, but that's the gist of what right to work does. Now, as a result of things in right to work laws, they make it harder for workers to form and maintain a union. And it's worth noting now that today, when we talk about union politics, oftentimes we're referring to public sector unions, because union membership in the private sector is below 10%, and union membership in the public sector is about a third. About a third of public employees are members of unions. So when we're having policy debates about unions in the present time, a lot of times we're talking about police officers, firefighters, teachers, state employees. These are the people that are members of strong unions. So I want to take a little time and talk about the arguments for and against right to work. So, arguments in favor. The first, most obvious one is no one should be compelled to be a member of a labor union. So you get a job someplace that's unionized, they have union representation, and no one that gets that job should have to pay union dues or fees toward the labor union if they don't want to be a member of the union. That's one argument in favor of right to work, is that it stops compulsory union membership. The groups that are in favor of right to work also argue that unions spend their dues and agency fees, which are a little bit different from each other, but for the purpose of this, we don't need to get too deep into the weeds there. That unions spend the dues and fees that they collect on political activity, and so by being forced to be a member of the union, and by having to pay dues or agency fees that are then spent on political activity, this is a violation of freedom of association and forcing individuals to spend money on political activities that they don't necessarily agree with. So there's an individual freedom and liberties argument made in favor of right to work. Economically, proponents of right to work say that it creates a strong business environment, that businesses want to move their factories to places that don't have unions that they have to deal with and negotiate with, and by creating a strong business environment, you're going to create jobs. And so there's also an economic argument to be made in favor of right to work. And this is not an exhaustive list of arguments in favor or against. These are just some basic ones. So, arguments against. Opponents of right to work say that right to work solves a non-existent problem. So, the proponents are saying that people are being compelled to be in a union, that they have to be in a union, but opponents of right to work say, well, no one is actually required to be in a union. You can opt out of the union even in pro-union, non-right to work states, and then you don't pay union dues. And up until recently, up until the Supreme Court ruled in Janus v. AFSCME that agency fees were unconstitutional, then if you weren't a member of the union, you still had to pay some fees because you're covered by the collective bargaining agreement. The labor union negotiates pay raises and working conditions and health benefits, and they are not allowed to only negotiate for their members. They have to negotiate for everybody in the workplace. So, even if you're not paying dues and you're not a member of the union, unions were still charging agency fees, which was supposed to go to the cost of negotiating those wages and benefits, the cost of collective bargaining. Unions argued in the court that those agency fees don't go toward political activity. The court basically said that collective bargaining is connected to politics, and ruled that people can't be forced to pay for services to a union that they don't belong to. But the union still has to cover them in the contract. So when somebody gets in trouble in the workplace, if the union sends a representative, they have to send a representative regardless of whether the worker is a member or not. So what they argue is, look, nobody has to be a member of a union. You were always able to opt out. But by not allowing us to charge any fees for the cost of negotiating contracts and pay raises that are in those contracts for all of the workers in the workplace, this creates a free rider problem. Nobody in the workplace has an incentive to pay for something that they get for free. So this undercuts the ability to maintain the union. And this is what opponents get at when it comes to right to work actually being about weakening the power of workers. It's not really, they argue, it's not really about individual freedoms. It's about making it so that you don't have to pay for the cost of collectively bargaining your raises and your benefits and your working conditions. You don't have to pay for those services. If you don't have to pay your union representatives for those services, then you're not going to, because you can get them for free. And then the union's going to go away because it can't fund itself. And so this is going to ultimately weaken the power of workers. And so that's what the free rider problem and weakening the power of workers argument is about. And then the arguments against right to work also come down to economics. Opponents of right to work will say, well, pro-union states have things like higher incomes. So let's dive a little bit more into how proponents and opponents frame this issue. So this is a graphic that would be for right to work. Please excuse, it's a little bit blurry, but basically what this graphic shows is, hey, look, right to work states have greater GDP growth, and non-right to work states have lower GDP growth. And total employment is up faster in right to work states than it is in non-right to work states. And the growth of personal income from 1977 to 2010, incomes have grown faster in right to work states compared to non-right to work states. And these are all things that show that right to work has some positive outcomes. Sometimes you'll hear the argument that proponents will say that there's lower unemployment in right to work states. There's mixed evidence on that, but they'll also say that when you adjust for cost of living, right to work states have a higher standard of living. So there's a number of economic arguments that advocates for right to work make in favor of right to work, on top of this issue being about individual freedom of association and your right to not be a member of a union. Now, opponents are quick to point out the negative outcomes of right to work, saying things like, "Well, we'll look at the wages in right to work states compared to bargaining states. That unions are a mechanism for upward mobility. That wages and benefits and poverty rates are better. So wages are higher, health benefits are better, poverty rates are lower in bargaining states compared to right to work states. That unions have grown the middle class, and they've done so through the bargaining mechanism and driving up wages and securing benefits. Also, they'll frame this as a safety issue. So, as you can see from this graphic, workplace fatalities are higher in right-to-work states than where unions are able to negotiate working conditions. When it comes to police officers, specifically when we talk about public employee bargaining, when it comes to police officers, oftentimes they'll argue, they need collective bargaining rights and strong unions to negotiate their safety. Working conditions that allow for 2 police officers to be in a car. They negotiate different equipment requirements. These different things that they say keeps them and the public safe. So, in this kind of crash course of right-to-work politics, what I want you to pay attention to is how we define the problem. When we're looking at policy analysis, let's look at the components of the right-to-work issue. Well, how do we define the problem? Is this about individual freedoms and rights, your right to not be a member of a union, or is it about the rights, the collective bargaining rights of workers that are in a union? A lot of times when states try to restrict the rights of workers in unions, pro-union advocates will say they're taking away our right to collectively bargain. Or is this about economics? So, is this about positive or negative economic outcomes for workers and Americans in general? And so, of course, when we look about constructing our alternatives, in this case, we're looking at right to work versus non-right to work, but it's important to note that there are other alternatives. So it is possible for states to restrict the activities of unions in non-right to work states through different mechanisms. So some states require unions to recertify and vote to basically vote to unionize regularly, and they create different requirements for what percentage of workers have to actually agree to be in the union for you to maintain your union. On the other hand, following Janus v. AFSCME, some states have passed legislation that allows the union to charge non-members for the cost of representation in grievance procedures or in any kind of workplace incidents that involve a non-member. So that helps a little bit solve that free rider problem. So it's important to remember that there are different alternatives outside of right to work and non-right to work, but we generally think of right to work a lot when we think about labor union issues. Also, when we're thinking about labor union issues, we have to think about the evaluative criteria we choose. You notice that both sides make an economic argument, but they use different criteria. Are you looking at poverty, health benefits, GDP, unemployment, wages controlled for cost of living? What is our measure, our economic measure of success? If it is entirely possible that the pro-union states have higher wages than the non-union states and the right-to-work states, but it's also possible that the right-to-work states have lower unemployment than the union states. Now, I don't know that either of those things are true empirically, but those are some arguments that are made, and those are some things that we do investigate as policy analysts. But we have to figure out what our evaluative criteria are. How are we measuring our success, and how is that going to help us decide whether right to work is okay, or right to work it has too many negative consequences. And then, of course, the other evaluative criteria is about liberty and freedom and your constitutional rights as an individual versus your rights to act collectively as a group of workers that want to form a union. So once you've figured out this evaluative criteria and defined the problem, then of course we have to assess our alternatives. Now, this is just skimming the surface of this labor issue, and my intent here, of course, is to not persuade you one way or the other about these arguments. Some of you may already have strong feelings about this, but think about this unit and what we're studying in terms of the policy analysis process, and go from there. Thank you.